Oops, Lizzie. Good afternoon, everybody. Right, Mr. Gill.
Yes, my lord. Next witness is Alison Leitch. The reference to her statement is SCIWT 0370 and then 501.
Right, now, good afternoon and welcome back, Ms. Leitch.
Thanks.
Good. Mr. Gill, when you're ready.
Thank you, my lord. Ms. Leitch, your full name is Alison Leitch, I think.
Yes.
And how old are you?
46.
Yeah. And you're currently employed, and the inquiry is aware of that, the nature of that employment, and also of your contact details. We have that information. You gave evidence 10 days ago as part of the Care Home Relatives Scotland core group, speaking to an organisational statement. And now you're providing a personal impact statement. And this is in relation to your mother, and we're not naming your mother, nor are we naming the care home where she was and is a resident. You're agreeable and have been agreeable to providing a statement to the inquiry, and you're agreeable to that statement being published.
Yes.
Okay. Your mother was a resident in a care home during the pandemic, and you provide us with some information about your mother prior to her going into care at paragraphs 5 to 12 of your statement. And just taking that relatively briefly, if I may, your mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when she was 60, is that right?
Yes.
And at that time, you were living and working abroad, and I think your mother and father were living together.
Yes.
And I think sadly your father died, and it was then that you returned to live in Scotland to assist with the care of your mother.
Yes.
And when you did return to live in Scotland, I think, as you stated, paragraph 6 of your statement, it was then really that you realized just how much care and support your mother needed. You also tell us that you and your brother had a power of attorney in relation to your mother's affairs, and that effectively you became her full-time carer.
Yes.
Your mother's condition declined, and she was moved into supported living about 10 years ago.
Yes, that's right.
And she didn't settle there, and indeed it was only a day later that she was moved to hospital. And then, with assistance from your mother's psychiatrist, she was moved into a care home.
That's right.
Yeah. And as you say at paragraph 15 of your statement, your 14 and 15 of your statement, your mother settled relatively quickly into the care home.
She said, my mum is a very quiet, unassuming lady that just needs kindness and chocolate.
I can share that desire, yes.
And because she was so young in comparison to the rest of the residents, it was like she kind of became a favourite. So she settled in very well, and we were made to feel very welcome, as Natasha mentioned this morning. You're made to feel that that is your mum's home.
Yeah. Her mobility at that stage was fine, as you say in paragraph 15 of your statement. She could walk a fair distance unaided, but dementia had pretty much destroyed her speech.
Yes, just as it was mentioned by Natasha, early onset dementia can be quite aggressive in different parts. And my mum slowly lost her speech, but we used to say from the head down she was physically well. Yeah. So we always, certainly for me anyway, anytime I went, we always left the building because she was able to, so why not?
Mm-hmm. And I think, well, from the head down, it might have been business as usual for her, and she was mobile. You make the point in 15 that her personality never changed.
No, if you can be lucky with dementia, you're lucky in that the personality doesn't change. Mm-hmm. No violence, no swearing, no.
And she had an active social life and was able to enjoy life, generally.
Very much so.
That active social life, how was that organised?
Well, as I mentioned, my uncle took my mum out once a week. I think they used to work their way around all the cafes. I was there twice a week. My brother was there twice a week, and we had to befriend her. I would take my mum to see her friends. We would go to cafes. So she was fairly active and out and about. And also the activities in the care home, they would have bus trips in the local park. There's a cycling with age where they're motorised bikes which cater for 2 people on the back. So there was lots of activities, so my mum was always out and about.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, she was out of the home regularly with
Yes.
you and other family members.
Yes.
You describe the onset of the pandemic and the effect it had on your mother in paragraph 17 and following of your statement. And I'd like to examine with you some aspects of that, if I may. Firstly, the closure of your mother's care home. You say in paragraph 17 that you went to see your mother on the 12th of March. You weren't allowed in. You weren't allowed to take her out, although you were told that it wasn't recommended. Is that right?
Yes. The member of staff actually walked past me and said I wasn't allowed to take my mum out as she walked into the garden to have a cigarette. So I queried it, and the assistant manager at the time, that was what I was told. It was not recommended. But I couldn't quite understand why going out for some fresh air wasn't going to be recommended. But they did allow that to happen.
Yeah. And then, as you say in paragraph 18, the following Monday, the care home phoned to say that they were closing, but that they had a tablet, so you could book a FaceTime call with your mother. And you said at that time to your brother that Mum would fall off the cliff if we couldn't have any contact. It may be really self-evident, but I don't suppose a FaceTime call and via a tablet is going to be terribly much use to your mother.
No, I remember it took over a week for me to see my mum smile on a FaceTime call.
Mm-hmm. And at paragraph 19 of your statement, and again this is reflecting some of the other evidence that we've heard, your mother was practically non-verbal, and you say she needed me to be beside her. She keeps her head down, isn't good with eye contact unless you're beside her. As with many people with dementia, body language and touch are essential.
Absolutely. And because we had never used any form of technology before, this would have all been new to her. I can only presume it was confusing. She could hear my voice, but she didn't know where I was. She didn't know where the voice was coming from. Depending on which member of staff was beside my mum, the ones that I knew, they would facilitate a conversation. They would engage with my mum, but there was occasions where there was a carer sat next to my mum that I didn't know and she didn't know me, and she would sit in silence. So I was having a conversation with nobody.
Yeah. Just looking at that, were you, or could you be aware as to whether your mother was coping with that situation, being communicated to through a tablet or something of that nature?
In a sense, yes. If it was a carer that was familiar with us, it was kind of almost like a three-way conversation with only two people speaking, but a familiar carer would be able to tell me what they'd been doing, or what my mum had eaten that day, or she'd had her music on or something. But if it was somebody that wasn't interacting with my mum, or if my mum wasn't doing so well, you could see, like my mum does try to speak, but it can be repetitive noises or words. It's like she's trying to speak, and you can also tell a lot by her face. You know, my mum can still laugh, she can still smile, but when her face was almost contorted, that I would try to calm things, or that's when I really needed the carer to engage to reassure my mum and calm her down, because, you know, I'm stuck behind a screen.
Can you let us know some details of that in paragraph 20 of your statement? And in particular, you say there were on occasions you thought that your mum was clawing her face, and you say it was very hard to watch her doing that and being so distressed and not being able to do anything. And you say she knew we weren't there and something was different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was there was twice I remember seeing that, and that was when she was isolated in her room. Yeah.
And I think you say that you'd never seen her that distressed.
Never. Since
the lockdown period started.
Never. And her dementia has deteriorated quite a lot since then.
Now, as with other witnesses, obviously we are focusing largely on the impact on your mother. But obviously this had an impact on you. Can you just describe that sort of situation where you were unable to communicate or be physically with your mother? What was the impact on you?
I think I've gone through every single emotion in the last 3 years. But that initial period, video calls were better than nothing. And I was still going over every Sunday to drop stuff off. So I was seeing my mum at a window, which was much better than a video call. So anything was better than nothing at those times. So I suppose by seeing her, I was reassured that she, you know, I could physically see her for myself. But it was as things progressed and things started opening up for society, that's, I suppose, when it hit, because there was nobody standing up for my mum. I used to think I was losing my mind at times, that my friends could go for dinner, go for coffee, they could go on holiday, but these restrictions were still enforced on my mum, and nobody seemed to be concerned about it.
I suppose you were having to surmise how your mother was coping with this, and obviously she couldn't communicate that to you. And so what sort of things were going through your mind as to how you thought your mother was coping with the situation she found herself in?
My mum's a tough cookie. You know, I've never really seen her. She seemed to, you know, growing up, she used to take things in her stride. So I was confident initially she would be okay because there was good staff. They knew her well. Didn't think this would go on for too long. But then, as it did go on, and I was seeing how distressed she was on video calls, you then start to think, where does she think we've gone? Does she think we've just abandoned her? So you're haunted by what is your mum thinking, and why could I not keep her at home? You start thinking, can I get her out? Can I move home? Can give up work? Can I go back to being a full-time carer? How can you resolve this situation? Because everything is out of your control.
We've heard from a number of witnesses about feelings of guilt. Did you have them?
I have guilt from the time my mum went into a care home.
Okay. Can we go to paragraph 21, please, of your statement? Just one point. You make the point that it was very difficult not to be able to reach out and touch your mother. And I think perhaps one of the examples of humanity was that a carer once slipped your mother's hand out so that you could touch it.
I remember coming home that night and speaking to my neighbour, and he kind of said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "I feel like somebody's charged me up." And then reading the Alzheimer's Scotland literature review that talks about skin hunger, that makes sense now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. I'll just take you on to paragraphs 24 and following. This was an incident in May 2020 where your mother had some unexplained bruising on her arm. I don't think you're making any criticism that this just happened. Mm-hmm. And it can obviously happen in care homes where other residents can do it, so it's not a criticism. And you, I think, wanted to see it. And initially you were told no, and then you were told you could do so if you had a mask on and washed your hands. Yep. But in the course of this, you touched your mother's arm, and one of the care home staff reported you for that.
The assistant manager had let me stand at the door and then said, "Wash your hands and put a mask on, and you can come in past the door," so that there wasn't cold air coming in. So I did that, and then a carer brought my mum out and they rolled up her sleeve, and there was this hand-shaped bruise, and it upset me. And my mum was still mobily fine then, but her spatial awareness is rubbish. So my mum was walking around, and because I was so upset, I just reached out and touched her with my fingertips. And a nurse came downstairs and shouted, "What is she doing in here? Get her out." So I was ushered out and my mum was taken away. And I came back to Edinburgh and I phoned, or I think the assistant manager phoned me to say that the nurse had reported me to the head office. And their words were, "Your mum has been taken away, stripped, showered and isolated for 14 days.
Yeah. I think you subsequently took a test which was negative, and you let the care home know that that was the case, and the isolation was restricted to 5 days, I understand.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. How did you feel about that?
I was devastated. I was devastated that I had caused this. I was devastated that my mum was now being treated like this. I was devastated that I had caused the care home extra work. I didn't leave my house until the results came back, because I had it in my head that if my mum wasn't allowed out, then why should I be?
Yeah. I think you say in paragraph 30 that you felt awful for what had happened, presumably because you blamed yourself. Well, it's not, nobody is blaming you.
No, I did.
Miss Leitch, but presumably you felt that way.
I did, but then, you know, after, when the result came back negative and everything could go back to normal, then you start thinking about it. And what did I do differently? I washed my hands, I had a mask on, that's all that staff were doing at the time. I just reacted in a way that any human being would react. But I didn't say anything because I had a sense that I had caused this trouble. I got a row from my brother for doing it. He said he understood why I did it, but he said it had to be you that did it.
Yeah, well, that's a brother for you. Yes. Can I ask you a little bit about window visits and garden visits, which you go on to in paragraphs 31 and following of your statement? Is there a distinction between window visits and garden visits, or are they used as the same concept?
We did have different ones. My mum's unit is on the ground floor, and the lounge is at the the dining room, is at the far end of the building, so it is floor to ceiling windows, so you could have a window visit standing up there. And then when they moved to garden visits, those were in the garden or the car park.
Yeah. Just on window visits, we say in paragraph 31 that the windows closed to you and not open as before. And you were told that this was good government guidance.
Yes.
Who told you that? I don't want the name, but who told you?
The manager.
Yeah. Did you check whether that was the case?
No. I wasn't aware of any government guidance at this time. I was just being told what the care company, we were getting regular updates from them, and obviously what had happened with me touching my mum. I wasn't going to question too many things.
Yeah. Now, you set out paragraphs 32 and following some points about garden visits, and I think in some ways these could more accurately be described as car park visits. Just tell us a little bit about how you would criticise, if you would, these sorts of visits. What was wrong with them, so far as you were concerned?
Well, the care home is in a cul-de-sac, a housing cul-de-sac, so there would be people in their gardens, there'd be people cutting their grass, all sort of noise going around. I was the only person that I knew that was getting a car park visit. I had to stay in my car, and there's a part of me that thinks that is because of the incident of me touching my mum, that I couldn't be trusted to be out my car.
I've heard criticism of these types of visits on the basis that they weren't very private. Is that something you experienced? Yeah.
I mean, you're sitting in an open space, staff would be coming and going. There was, as I say, there was noise from gardens around. I was shouting at my mum. There was a carer next to her, but that was needed because of my mum's poor spatial awareness. So for her safety, there needed to be somebody there. But you had to watch somebody hug your mum, hold her hand, reassure her, whilst I'm shouting. It wasn't very dignified.
No. I'm not wanting to suggest anything to you, Ms. Leitch, but was there an understandable degree of envy on your part when you saw other people being able to interact with your mother when you couldn't?
I think the initial feeling was that somebody was able to comfort her. And that she was my main concern, so as long, yeah, of course, I'd rather I comforted her, but if somebody else was able to do it, because we've since heard in other government meetings when we've spoke about this that we've been shot down to say that carers shouldn't have been comforting their loved ones. So if some carers weren't comforting residents, then I feel quite lucky that somebody was.
That's paragraph 38 of your statement. You talk about an inside visit in the cafe room in presumably a mother's care home in August 2020. And well, it may seem, I suppose, a slightly insignificant matter And presumably, and you mentioned it specifically, your mother's hair had got long and was beyond. So was that, again, one of the areas that, as a consequence of lockdown and restrictions, tended to just be ignored? Personal appearance and these sort of matters?
Yeah, hairdressers weren't allowed back in the home for quite some time. So it would be left to some carers if you asked them to cut hair. And my mum's hair is short, so it very quickly can go out of control almost. And you know, we've brought this up in government meetings about care home residents' dignity. You know, when the rest of us could go back to having hair done and different things, they just weren't allowed. And at that point, there was no scope for hairdressers to come back. And even when things did improve, the hairdresser was going between various homes. So I asked if I could take my mum to my hairdresser, who had their own shop and had offered to open it up just for my mum. And I was told, I'd rather you didn't, because I don't know what your hairdresser does.
Yeah. And the other point you make in 38 is about your mother getting up and walking towards you. And as a consequence of that, in order to preserve the distance between you, you yourself had to keep moving. You say that having to do that, particularly under the supervision of care home staff, you put it was heartbreaking.
I can relive it in my mind. The carer was actually sitting on this side of the room, so wasn't next to my mum, and there was a round table between us. And again, it was slightly better than being in the car park, but I'm shouting at my mum, she's keeping her head down, and then she just got up and started walking towards me. So it took the carer it wouldn't have taken too long, but she had to get up and cross the room. And all I could do was keep pushing my chair back, trying to keep this distance. And you're like, that's my mum.
Yeah. And obviously your mum wouldn't be able to understand why you were doing it.
No.
Okay. Can we move on to essential visits? And paragraph 39 and following, you tell us about a conversation you had with Natasha Hamilton, who gave evidence this morning, and then a conversation with a representative of Alzheimer's Scotland. And it was then that you became aware of essential visits. So this is not a criticism, Ms. Leitch, but you hadn't been aware of that before then?
No, very similar to what Natasha described earlier. No, I didn't know anything about that. The befriender that my mum had, and prior to the pandemic, was an Alzheimer's Scotland befriender, and I had no contact from them.
Okay. And if one is looking at perhaps a position of a care home, one might have expected a care home to be proactive in informing the families of residents as to the existence of the concept of essential visits, but that didn't happen, as I understand it.
No, although now you've mentioned, I do remember the sign on the door said closed, no entry, and then very small, apart from essential visits. And I think at the time I had asked what was an essential visit, and I was told it was end of life. Right. So that was very, very early on.
And I think we understand particularly from Ms. Hamilton's evidence, that an essential visit could also include a situation where the person being visited suffered dementia or was distressed.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. But that wasn't brought home to you by anybody within the care home industry?
No.
Right. You also tell us at paragraph 43 that your mother, excuse me, Your mother trapped her hand and needed stitches. And you tell us that an arrangement had been made for your mother to be taken to hospital following that. But she was taken to hospital in a taxi. And obviously with a driver who was a stranger to her. There was never any question of you taking her to hospital.
I asked if I could take my mum, and it was on a weekend, so there was no manager in, and the nurse just said to me, please don't ask me that.
Okay. And it may be, again, fairly evident, Ms. Leitch, but how did you feel about a situation where your mother was being taken to a hospital in a taxi by a stranger?
Absolutely helpless. I could have... My mum was hurt. I didn't know how badly she was hurt. I knew there was a risk if she stayed in hospital for any length of time, she would have to be isolated, because I had met the others in care home relatives and I knew there was experience of this. I was terrified that she was going to be shut in her room. And I knew when the nurse said, don't ask me if you can take her in the car, that just don't push this anymore. But then again, because you're always grateful for what you get, you don't want to push your luck. But then, of course, it was just like, well, I don't want to delay my mum getting to hospital, so just take her in a taxi. But then afterwards, it's like, how can that make sense? How can a taxi that could have had multiple people in the car that day be deemed safer than me?
Yeah. I think, fortunately, it wasn't a particularly bad injury, and it was something that could be dealt with relatively quickly.
It was, and she wasn't isolated afterwards.
Yeah. Paragraph 45, you tell us about, well, before I go to that, by this time you had become involved with Care Home Relative Scotland.
That's right.
And did that increase your awareness of matters of guidance and, as it were, rights that you might have or your mother might have in relation to visiting? Oh,
definitely. Definitely, and it was such a relief to find out about this group, because if you don't know other people that have loved ones in a care home, it's very isolating. Certainly none of my peers have a parent in a care home, and you're just living this life very isolated. So to find this group was just a godsend, and you had people feeling exactly the same about you. So you very quickly became aware of all this paperwork and guidance that existed, that it wasn't anything like what life used to be like. So collectively, there was this agreement that we had to do something about it. So very quickly got up to speed with what was out there.
And really, I suppose as a consequence of becoming involved with Care Home Relative Scotland and various meetings that you had with government representatives, you became aware of guidance that had been published in October 2020, which stated that residents were to receive 4 hours worth of visits per week with touch.
That was after the protest.
Yes.
And the first meeting with Jean Freeman, I was invited to join the second meeting, and that's when Jean Freeman said that she would change the guidance to the 4 hours a week with touch.
And you say that when the guidance came out, the care home management said that they would try it, and you spoke to a representative of the care home, again, please don't name him, and there was a suggestion, at least, that you would trial a visit with your mum based on that guidance?
That person used to be in government meetings,
Yeah.
so
And just tell us, well, you do in paragraph 46, about that trial visit. Actually, you just read 46 out for us.
I got to go in to visit my mum in the relatives' room, sit next to her and hold her hand for an hour. I didn't go near anyone for days before the visit. During this visit, I was still covered from head to toe in plastic. But the care staff told me that my mum was so settled that night. I had 3 visits where I could sit next to my mum and hold her hand. I was only allowed inside by myself, but for my brother to see my mum, we had to be outside. So we tried to have visits outside as much as possible. I had 3 touch visits in total.
Yeah. And I think you go on to mention yes, I think you mentioned in 47 your I think it's your mother's birthday, was it? And something as simple as blowing out candles wasn't allowed, presumably.
No.
You could expel air and droplets from your mouth by doing it. And you weren't allowed to take off your masks to eat birthday cake.
No.
Now, that didn't last very long, these touch visits.
No.
And the decision to withdraw those touch visits, and again, please don't name anybody, but that was a decision taken by the care home, was it?
It was a care provider.
The care provider. And what was, as far as you were aware, were you aware of the rationale for withdrawal of those visits?
Initially, there was a lot of confusion. Another relative had contacted me to say that she had tried to book one of these visits and had been told no. Then I phoned and the carers had said they had just been told that they were back to distance visits. I then had to escalate it, and I was eventually told that the provider thought that Jean Freeman was wrong and that these type of visits were too risky, and they thought we would have to wait until the vaccinations were in place.
Was the government guidance changed, or was that a matter of interpretation by the care home?
The government guidance was for 4 hours with touch. That's what the guidance said.
Mm-hmm. And that remained the government guidance. But in essence, it was not followed by the care home. The care home, at its discretion, took the view that it should not be followed.
That's right. That's when we started to hear guidance is only guidance.
Yep. Okay. Now, paragraph 50, you talk about the longer visits that you had with your mother, and that you noticed that her mobility had declined a lot. Just explain how you noticed that. What was it about her that brought that home to you?
Well, the distance visits, quite often my mum would already be in the car park, or she would be in the room, or she would be in the garden already, because you had to be escorted in and out. And so I would just see my mum sitting in a chair. But those longer visits I had with her, because I was allowed to touch her, like especially if we were inside, my mum would get up, or if there was music on, we would just do so. I didn't want her just sat still, but because I got to spend that time with her on her own, and that's not a criticism because I knew she had to be supervised, so I could look after my mum, and if she got up I would help her, that I noticed she was kind of more shuffling and certainly much slower. Now, I hadn't said anything about that initially because we were getting these 4 hours with touch, so I thought, well, I can work on this with my mum. But when the provider chose not to follow that guidance, that is then when I asked for essential visits because of the deterioration I was seeing.
Now, you would be applying your assessment of that against your mother's situation really pre-pandemic and her ability to mobilise at that stage. So in that period of time, how would you describe the extent of the deterioration in her mobility?
Prior to the pandemic, there was a couple of times my mum just had unexplained bruising, which again, as we've mentioned, it's not a criticism of anybody. It's because of her spatial awareness. Yeah. Sometimes she would have little bruises on her face because she would literally just walk into things, or she bends down quite a lot as if she sees something to pick up, so she could maybe bang her head off something. So they put her on hourly checks, which were almost just to find out where she was, because she was just always on her feet. So then when you suddenly see somebody who is shuffling, that's quite a deterioration.
Yeah. Now, once you notice that restriction or change in her mobility, you requested, as you say in paragraph 50, essential visits, and you say at first you didn't receive a response, pursued it, and was told by the manager that your mum didn't meet the criteria.
Yes.
And I think you escalated that further after that, and you were told at some point that essential visits were for end of life only, and that she was, this is the care home manager, was keeping residents safe. You did escalate that further. What was the outcome of escalating it further?
I escalated it to the CEO, who I knew through the government meetings and who had asked me to trial the visits. I had a very lengthy conversation with him. I made it very clear I didn't want to be in the building, that I wanted to walk with my mum in the garden. I didn't want to put anybody else at risk. I wanted to keep my mum as safe as possible being outside, and I also wanted to keep her. I didn't know how often she was getting out, so fresh air would be good for her. And he said to me he would do what he could to get me essential visits and to leave it with him. He then contacted me. He sent me an email about a week later, and I think it was about at Haymarket when I read it, and I think I was hysterical the whole 10-minute walk I had to do before I could get a hold of him on the phone. And he just told me that the manager had spoken to the care inspectorate and social work, and they were all in agreement that my mum didn't meet the criteria.
They were in agreement with that?
They were in agreement. Mm-hmm. Nobody asked me for any opinion. Social work hadn't been near my mum for years. We'd never had any need for the care inspectorate. I could not get my head around how a decision had been made with nobody actually seeing my mum, knowing my mum, asking my opinion of anything. So I then phoned the care I spent the rest of that day on the phone to the care inspectorate and social work, explaining what had happened and questioning things. The care inspectorate actually turned round and said that they were wrong, but there had been no recording of the conversation. So my only option would be to make a formal complaint And when I spoke to social work, it was a duty social worker that had made this decision, and it would be recorded on my mum's file.
So did you get an essential visit at any stage thereafter?
I did. About a month later, the manager was off sick, so the assistant manager was acting up, and this was when the lateral flow tests were just being introduced, and I think Jean Freeman had pushed for the lateral flow tests, all the training to be done so that relatives could have a Christmas Day visit, because we were going back into lockdown on Boxing Day. So by the time the training was done, it only really left about a week's window, and for some reason the assistant manager gave out the 4 or 5 Christmas Day visits without telling all the relatives. It seemed that whoever had asked got a visit, and by the time I asked, there was no visits left, and he'd given 5 one-hour visits. It's a 40-bed home. So I had complained about this and ended up speaking to an area director about this, and went through the whole scenario over essential visits. And he promised me he would do what he could. And somehow he phoned me back on Christmas Eve to tell me that I had essential visits and a Christmas Day visit.
Oh. I'll come to that in a moment. Outside visits did continue during this time, as I understand it.
No, the assistant manager stopped outside
that
visits.
has been stopped, has it?
Because it was too cold.
Right. Just probably I've taken this slightly out of order, but at paragraph 61 of your statement, you say there that a duty nurse said that this was not something that a member of staff would do. You stated that if my mum was my priority, I wouldn't have her sitting out in the cold. And you told the nurse that I wasn't a liar and that I was doing my best so that my mum could see her children. Can you just explain the context of that, please?
So, for my mum to see my brother and I, it had to be an outside visit. And I knew I wanted my brother to be able to see his mum, because you couldn't alternate a visit inside. So we would arrange to go on a weekend, and there was a gazebo, a very flimsy gazebo in the garden, and we would play it by ear every week as to how cold it was, whether we should go ahead with it. We would take advice from the care home, and we decided this day to go ahead with it. The care home provided blankets. We had bought a little hot water bottle to go inside my mum's jacket to keep her warm. So we were sitting in this garden, in the garden with her. And my mum has a little twitch where she bounces her knee. And the carer kept putting her hand on her knee. And I asked her not to do it. And she said, "Your mum's cold." I said, "She's not cold, that's her little twitch." She'd only been out for 5-10 minutes, and I said, "We're not staying because it is getting cold." And other comments were made that just played on my mind. So later that day, I phoned back just to ask, had my mum been cold? What was she like when she went back in? And that's when I was told that if my mum was my priority, I wouldn't have her sitting out in that cold.
And what was your reaction to that?
I was devastated.
Okay. I think you'd taken us on, it's my fault entirely, Ms. Leitch, but you had taken us on to Christmas essential visits. I think you talk about that at paragraph 65 and following. You were able to secure, as I think you've indicated, a Christmas visit, but I think you surmised that that may well have been due to your involvement in care home relatives. Why do you do that?
Sorry?
Why do you do that? Why do you make that assumption?
I think because I knew the guidance inside out by this point. I probably knew more than some of the staff in the care homes, and because of the people from that provider that were in the government meetings, they knew who I was. Just to go back to your previous point about that nurse's comment, that comment devastated me that much that I was signed off my work the next day, because I couldn't do any more than I was doing for my mum. And to be told your mum isn't your priority when I was doing every single thing in my power that I could do, that broke me.
Yeah.
And that is when my work kindly said that I could have carers leave to continue my involvement in care home relatives, as opposed to having to make back the time, because I still do have a full-time job.
Yeah. Can you go on to paragraph 69 to March of 2021? This was the first time you were able to take your mother out in a car. And this was, as you say, allowed 30-minute visits within, so it was still only allowed 30-minute visits within the home. How was that escalated up to you being able to take your mum in a car?
I asked.
Simple as that?
Yeah. I think because, as I said to you, I always took my mum out. You know, I know there'll be a time when I can't take her out. And I think she spends far too much time in that home. So that was almost my driver, get her out. She's been in there for a year. So I asked if we could go to the cemetery and explain the length of time it would take. But I do think the driver behind that was the work that Sheila within her group had done with the IPC consultants, that I had a leaflet of how to take somebody out safely in the car.
Is this the work that had begun with, going back several months, with the letter to the Nursing Times that we talked about, and that higher level of infection control?
Yes.
Yeah. What was your mother's reaction to being taken out in the car?
I think I go on to mention in that I was a bit anxious. Would she know how to get in the car? Would she get car sickness? Because it'd been over a year since she'd been in a car. How would she respond? But she did okay. She still could get in and out the car. But I think that was the first time I really realised how distant she seemed, because whenever we were in the car, we would always have music on. Music is probably the best medicine you can use with somebody with dementia. And she would either hum or tap her foot or tap her hands or try to sing along with the music. We always had a bit of a laugh in the car with music. And she sat next to me and there was no reaction at all.
Yeah. Am I right in, did I pick up that you were able to take your mother and give her access to relatives that she had not seen for a long time?
Yeah, I took longer than 40 minutes that day.
Yeah, you stretched it. Yeah, okay. You do say at the end of paragraph 70 that you became aware, at least, that your mother seemed to be more like her old self.
It was like rebuilding a relationship or reconnecting. Maybe she had to get used to me being there again. But that, it was a blessing, I guess, that she did. Her old self came back a little bit with the music. We would always have a laugh. Neither of us can sing, but we try. And you would get the odd little smile or the odd little giggle, so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. And as you said, and as you just said, you say it seemed odd having to build a relationship with your mother. And again, can I just ask you what was your feeling about having to do that?
Well, as Natasha explained earlier, you know, every day you lose a bit of your mum when there's dementia. Every day her brain is deteriorating, and you don't know if you can rebuild anything. You don't know if you can get anything back. So it's always a little bit of apprehension as to what is still there. I mean, I was delighted she could still get in a car. She can still get in my car today. But that whole thing about, does my mum remember how to kiss anybody? And I mean, I absolutely, other than pushing my 40 minutes, I stuck by all the rules. I always kept my mask on in the car, the windows were open. I wasn't going to do anything that put my mum at risk. Yeah. So by the time you were able to give her a little kiss or ask her for a kiss, you're very apprehensive, because if that has gone, then how do you deal with that? Because with dementia, you're constantly waiting on the next thing to go.
Can we go to paragraph 76, please? And this is about a revisal of the guidance to say that testing was only necessary if the resident had been somewhere mixing with others. And you say on one occasion a carer insisted that your mum was to be tested before we went out, and you refused to allow that to happen because, as you said, it wasn't in the guidance. And again, from what you've said earlier, you were probably more of an expert on the guidance than anyone else in this scenario.
It was, because I think we had come up against this in guidance when they introduced that a resident had to be tested before they went out and when they came back. And I asked, well, what if the resident isn't going anywhere? What if they are just going out for a walk outside of the care home, or they're just going for a run in the car? Because I would have still been testing at that time. And that was when the government guidance then reflected that. But I remember sitting that night with the guidance on my phone, showing the carers, my mum doesn't have to be tested. And it was a carer that had been there for a long time. And we have a really good relationship with her. And she was in tears saying, don't make me fall out with you because we have to test her. And I stood my ground and I said, I'm not consenting to you testing her because the guidance says. And they said, we don't have to follow government guidance.
I think you indicated, so the end of paragraph 76, that this indicated or highlighted the lack of understanding and confusion of guidance.
The last thing, I mean, as I say, I have a lovely relationship with the carers that are still at my mum's because they've been a huge part of our family for so long. The last thing I want to do is get into a standoff or have them in tears. But it was so frustrating. And as I say, I know more about care homes than I ever wanted to know. But I knew that guidance inside out. And my mum just wasn't being tested.
This was a put your foot down moment, was it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. You tell us at paragraph 78 that in August 2021 you tested positive for COVID. And what were the consequences of that?
I got another row from my brother. My mum was classed as a close contact and isolated in her room. Again, that's the guilt that you've done this. So I thought the only way I could try and help my mum was to see if I could get her tested to see if she had COVID. Because things were so opening up, well, they had opened up for everybody else, and there was different, the restrictions had loosened so that if you were deemed as a close contact, you could take a lateral flow test and go about your daily business. So I thought the least I can do is get somebody to treat my mum in this way. And I contacted Public Health, and they just flatly refused to test my mum. And I pushed and I pushed, And then they eventually agreed, but then said it wouldn't matter what the result was. She wasn't coming out of isolation. And at this very point, Nicola Sturgeon was a close contact, but was able to take a lateral flow test and attend the Edinburgh Book Festival.
Yeah. Okay. And you say that generally this was an issue that you raised with government, and your belief is that the guidance was revised in October and November. How was it revised? Do you remember?
Because of our group raising it. Mm-hmm. It was... I don't know. I work in health and social care now. Previously to me looking after my mum, I worked in corporate banking. I did a little bit of project management where you would trial every possibility, you would trial every outcome, you would look at every possibility that could come up. And when things were so open for the general public, it seemed as if nobody was thinking through this guidance and what the implications would be, because it seemed to be people within our group that hit these blocks, which then meant we had to go back to the government and say, this doesn't make any sense. Now, this happened on a couple of occasions with my mum. But why was that left to a group of relatives? Why did nobody else think this through? Because if we made enough noise about it, but it wasn't about making noise, it was just about pointing out the obvious. If a care home resident is only going out the front door for a walk, or going for a run in the car, or going to one person's house that there's nobody else in there, why do they have to be tested? And you'd present it and they'd go, yeah, you're right, we better change that guidance.
Mm-hmm. Was it a surprise to you that that rationale had not been thought about?
Knowing what I know now, no, but I was at the time.
Not quite sure I follow that.
At the time, I'd think, well, why haven't you thought about this?
Yeah.
But then, having gone through all this for 3 years, you can understand now why nobody did.
And why do you think nobody did?
I think it's like we touched on through our group evidence. There was no one person in charge. That understood care homes or understood how care homes worked. We've heard repeatedly about public health. They had people drafted in from public health from all different areas of public areas I don't even know. But some of these people had never set foot in a care home. Did they think that the residents go out? Didn't go out. But there was just this lack of awareness of what life is like in a care home.
Just on the point of, I suppose, obliquely, the concern that you had that one person wasn't in charge. You do say in paragraph 79 that, and this is under reference to the Christmas 2021 bubbles that we all heard about, you say that that was one of the very few times Nicola Sturgeon mentioned care homes in the same breath as the public. And I think we've heard that from your colleague Natasha Hamilton this morning. And you say in paragraph 80, our relatives were rarely spoken about in the public briefings. This made me feel as if my mum didn't matter. I suppose it's really, again, asking you the obvious, but you're reflecting a disappointment that there was not, within the public briefings, mention of care home residents.
Yes. I think the way everything was dealt with in Scotland, it seemed to me like most of the population would join these briefings to find out what was going to happen, what was going to be the next step. So you kind of joined with bated breath, waiting to hear. And then care home residents just never appeared in that. So that feeling, yeah, my mum just didn't matter. She wasn't on anybody's radar.
Right. I think you've mentioned this in the course of your group evidence last week, but you did ask to meet the former First Minister, and you raised that in paragraph 81 of your statement, but that didn't happen.
No, and I think it was more than twice that we asked to meet her, and certainly in meetings we would bring it up. We wouldn't make. I think there was 3 times we wrote officially asking for a meeting, and then in various meetings we would ask for a meeting, but it never happened. And I think one of the harshest points was when Monica Lennon, MSP, who has always been a great supporter of care home relatives, raised in Parliament, and she said in Parliament that Natasha's mum had passed away, and Nicola Sturgeon never acknowledged that.
Can I just take you forward a little to paragraph 84 and the events running up to Christmas 2022? Because I think what happened then was that there was a statement put out on Christmas Eve in relation to your mother's care home that Public Health had stated that no visits were to be allowed. Again, probably obvious, but what was your reaction to that, given that that was the 3rd Christmas?
Well, I knew that Christmas wasn't going to be as we had planned, because there was norovirus,
yes,
suspected flu and suspected COVID within the home. So it had gone to the 3 named visitors, which is kind of the foundation of Anne's Law. So it had been agreed that I would go in and see my mum, and if she wasn't impacted by any illness, I would take her out and she would see my brother on Christmas Day at his house. However, it was about 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve. I got the phone call. It was absolute sheer disbelief that I was being told this, and even the poor nurse that had to make those phone calls, she said to me, I've been nursing 30 years and I have never heard of a care home being closed for flu. And that was a resident had tested positive for flu. I said to her on the phone that I had essential visits on the care plan, and that I would be coming in to see my mum, unless my mum was poorly in any way, but that I would be coming in to see her. And she knew that essential visits were on the care plan, so she didn't have a problem with that.
And I think you mentioned in paragraph 84 that Public Health reversed that decision on Boxing Day night without any explanation.
Yes. Yep. And I've still I still, words fail me about this. After everything that we have been through, somebody made a decision to ruin Christmas again. I saw families shouting through windows on Christmas Day last year. The place was so empty. We had, there was quite a lot of new people have moved into my mum, so you don't really see families. But I knew there was a lady who had moved in. Her and her husband must be in their late 70s, married for forever. He really struggles with his wife being in that care home, and he had been planning to have his Christmas lunch with her, and that was ruined on a locum's decision.
Yes. I think you mentioned that it was a locum's decision.
Yeah, I know that there was people that were preparing for that to be their last Christmas because their relatives were really poorly. And I just think what they did was unforgivable. I wrote to Kevin Stewart and the government team. I don't think it was Christmas night, but probably the next day. I have no doubt that somebody went through public health, and that, as I say, the decision was reversed within 48 hours. But that highlights the risk and the threat that we all live with, that somebody can make that decision. And I also know that quite a lot of the families impacted, they haven't lived through the pandemic. They don't know the guidance. They'll just take what they're being told. And I think Natasha touched on it earlier. There has to be some commitment to making people aware of the guidance or the rules or whatever they need to do, so that nobody can make that decision. You know, Kevin Stewart said it was a blip. I don't think it was a blip. I think it was luck that it happened to my mum's home, because it was me that flagged. I got in to see my mum. I didn't have to contact the government. But because it happened to my mum, or to the home, but how many care homes up and down this country has that happened to that people don't know and are just taking everything on face value?
Right, finally, Ms. Leitch, can I ask you just a little bit about Anne's Law, because you have talked about this in your organisational statement. Could you go to paragraph 93, please, in your statement? And I think you make the point that it was a party of government's election manifesto to deliver Anne's Law, and that you still don't have it. And you've made the point about that in your organisational evidence. Perhaps one thing taking on from that, do you have any optimism as to whether Anne's Law will be enacted?
I have to.
Is that realistic?
I have to hope it is, because we've been doing this for 3 years, and it's been helpful that since the start of the inquiry there has been a lot of focus on Anne's Law. Other MSPs have picked up on it. Alzheimer's Scotland raised about it being watered down. I'd like to think that they have to change it. And I think, as Natasha said as well, I don't think any of us will stop until it is changed, because no one should have the right to cut my mum off from the ones that mean most to her. And I think every one of us in this room is an accident or illness away from needing care. And we need to be thinking about how would we want to be treated if we were to end up in full-time care.
Another point in that same section of your statement, 94, paragraph 94, you mentioned I think a recurring criticism of the government was that it would roll out advice or guidance late on a Friday afternoon. And you say that they continue to do this. Has that changed in any way, do you know?
Well, there's certainly not the volume of guidance coming out anymore. And I know it's been raised many, many times by various different sectors and or partners within the care sector about the Friday afternoon guidance. But what it would mean is, because we had seen, we'd seen what the proposed changes in advance, we would have fed back on it. We knew what was coming, and then we'd probably very quickly do a bullet point summary and get that up on our group, so that by the time the managers were even in on the Monday to pick up the guidance, our members knew exactly what was expected. Because it was always huge, lengthy documents. So what we would, or Sheila was the expert at it, Sheila would condense it into bullet points to say, this is what you need to know. But I don't know when the last guidance came out, but it was something we continually fed back, but it didn't really change.
Could I take you on to what is one of your concluding points, paragraph 105 in your statement, please? And perhaps you would just read that, because I think it does encapsulate a lot of what you've already said.
People with dementia were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. The removal of routines and familiarity has a significant impact on an individual with dementia. My mum would have declined cognitively anyway due to her condition, but I feel that she declined faster, especially in terms of her mobility, due to the restrictions on her and in the home.
And you go on to talk about your inability to enforce any of the powers under your power of attorney.
Yes.
Ms. Leitch, that's all I have to ask you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Leitch. Very good,
Well,
ladies and gentlemen.
The end today.
Friday, I'm afraid, at 10 o'clock.